All right, so this lecture is focused in on cannabis and what role it might play in the opioid epidemic. Specifically, can cannabinoids be used to address the opioid epidemic? And basically, the evidence suggests that pain management is central to the opioid epidemic. There are reviews indicating that cannabis products are effective at reducing the experience of pain, and you can look at the National Academy of Sciences review. We just talked about that in the last module. There are studies of prescription data suggesting that people are substituting cannabis for prescription pain medication. We'll talk more about that in this lecture. There are also cross-sectional studies suggesting people report that cannabis is an effective substitute for opioids. There are experimental studies in both humans and animals suggesting an opioid-sparing effect, meaning that people who use cannabis may then end up using less opioids. It works that way in animals as well, or in animal models. However, despite all of these suggestions, there's something going on there that might suggest that cannabis or cannabis products might be useful for people who are trying to reduce their opioid use. It's important to point out that there are currently no gold standard studies out there demonstrating that a cannabis product is effective at helping people reduce their opioid use. Despite the fact that there are no gold standard studies, clearly, and we'll talk about these studies in more detail, but clearly there's enough evidence to suggest that somebody should be doing a gold standard study on this question. Now, I just gave you, like in a nutshell, kind of the evidence that's out there in terms of this question of whether cannabinoids can be used to address the opioid epidemic. Some people have argued it's actually the opposite, that cannabinoids might make the opioid use epidemic worse. And I'll show you the one or two studies they usually cite to support that position as well. Okay, so let's start with this. There are now at least a couple, actually more than a couple, studies out there in the literature showing that cannabis legalization may have a positive impact in terms of prescription of opioids. So these two citations at the bottom, you can look at those in more detail. I recommend Googling those and taking a look. But here's the money shot, right? Here's what's important. Basically, one of the findings was that states with active dispensaries basically have 3.742 million fewer daily doses of opioids compared to states without active dispensaries. And so that's a pretty stunning finding there. And people, detractors will suggest that it's just one study. There might be some methodological issues, but now there's basically been more than one study. And there's still some potential issues in terms of, cause and effect here, but certainly there seems to be some association with states that have more dispensaries also having fewer prescriptions for opioids. This is a study looking at self-reported outcomes. When people are using opioids using cannabis to reduce opioid use. And so the title of the study is Cannabis as a Substitute for Opioid-Based Pain Medication, Patient Self-Report. So this is what patients are saying. Again, not a gold standard study, just a cross-sectional survey study asking patients, what's going on when you basically try using cannabis to cut back on your opioid use. So this is, the very first piece of data here. This is asking people, are they able to decrease their opiate use with cannabis? And the light blue is strongly agree, the dark blue is agree. So basically you see here that 97% of people are agreeing that they can use cannabis to reduce their opiate use. And you can go down just the slide here and look at these different responses. And the bottom line is it's pretty overwhelmingly positive in terms of what people are saying with respect to cannabis as a substitute for opiate use. And in fact, this is the very last bar here is exactly that. You would use more as a substitute if available. So basically 93% of people are saying they would make even better use of cannabis as a substitute if they were able to. Okay, so moving on. This is a study by Jacob Vigil looking at the association between medical cannabis and prescription opioid use in chronic pain patients in New Mexico. And what I will highlight here for you is this table at the top of the table, how many people ceased using opioid prescriptions. So these are the people in the medical cannabis program versus the comparison group. You can see 40% ceased in the medical cannabis group, 3% ceased in the control group. Pretty overwhelmingly positive there. And then how many were reduced their daily opioid dosage? 84% reduced in the medical cannabis program and 45% reduced in the comparison group. They also asked about pain prior to the cannabis program and pain after the cannabis program. And you can see here the, on a 0 to 10 scale, pain was 8.6 before, 5.3 after. A small study, but still I think useful in terms of, again, suggesting that we should do a bigger, better study on why or how people use cannabis to reduce opioid use and whether or not it's really effective. So here is a more experimental study, not so much a clinical study, by Ziva Cooper. And Ziva actually, I did an interview with her for this module, and I highly encourage you to look at that interview because she talks in more detail about her findings. This is a seminal paper that she published, basically looking at the combination of oxycodone and cannabis. And so here she's comparing 2.5 milligrams of oxycodone to 2.5 milligrams plus cannabis to cannabis only, and then doing the same thing for 5 milligrams of oxycodone. And the important piece here, if you look at this graph over here, in the solid circles, we have the group that got 2.5 milligrams of oxycodone plus cannabis. You can see their pain threshold is significantly greater when they get both of those things compared to just oxycodone or just cannabis. And you can see the threshold is actually even slightly higher than the comparison with the 5 milligrams. And so this is where that suggestion of an opioid sparing effect is coming from. And there have been a number of studies now in both animals and humans suggesting that the combination of cannabis and an opioid actually can lead to less opioid and the same pain-reducing effect, right? So the point being that you can have the same pain-reducing effect with less of a dose of an opioid if you combine it with cannabis. And that's been done in animals. And then Ziva's contribution is showing, that it works the same way or in a similar way in humans as well. And I encourage you to go and look at that paper and read more about it. Okay, so I hit some of the evidence here in terms of this question about whether cannabinoids can be used to address the opioid epidemic. And I also told you that we still don't have any gold standard studies, but we have a number of studies to suggest that we should be doing this gold standard studies. Now, I also told you that some people suggested that cannabinoids make or would make the opioid use disorder worse. And I think in our last module, I talked about the President's Commission on the opioid use epidemic. So in a previous lecture, we covered that. And basically there, the commission said very clearly, oh, no. Cannabinoids have zero positive impact on this issue and, in fact, are likely to make it worse. Now, where is the evidence coming from that people cite that it might make it worse? So here are two studies, and we'll discuss them briefly. One is the National Epidemiologic Survey of Alcohol and Related Conditions, or NESARC. This paper was published in 2018. And what it looked at cannabis use at wave 1. National Epidemiologic Survey of Alcohol and Related Conditions, or very clearly, oh, no, no, no. Cannabinoids have a zero positive impact on this issue and, in fact, are likely to make it worse. Now, where is the evidence coming from that people cite that it might make it worse? So here are two studies, and we'll discuss them briefly. One is the National Epidemiologic Survey of Alcohol and Related Conditions, or NESARC. This paper was published in 2018. And what it is, it looked at cannabis use at wave 1 and showed it was associated with non-prescription opioid use disorder at wave 2. Right? So basically, they're looking at cannabis use at one time point and again showing that it predicts or is associated with opioid use disorder at a subsequent time point. Now, there are a couple of issues with this study. First of all, it does make total sense that people who are using drugs recreationally to get high at time point 1 might be more at risk for opioid use disorder at time point 2. That makes total sense. However, it's somewhat irrelevant to the question about whether chronic pain patients can use cannabis medicinally as a substitute for opioids, right? So